What if I told you that a single block of ancient clay may hold a secret powerful enough to rewrite the entire story of human civilization? Not a myth, not a metaphor, but an object you could hold in your hands, heavy, silent, and impossibly old, carrying a number so colossal that even modern history reels beneath it. Most artifacts from the ancient world whisper. This one does not. It speaks in a calm, bureaucratic voice, a voice so confident, so precise, that if it is telling the truth, then our timeline is not simply incomplete, it is shattered. For more than a century, this small, dust-colored prism has been sitting behind museum glass, ignored by most visitors, glanced at, maybe photographed, then forgotten. But if you lean close enough to read the etched, wedge-shaped lines, you find a claim that seems to defy logic. Before the world you know began, 8 kings ruled the earth for 241,200 years. Not combined mythologies, not symbolic metaphors. A list. A list with names, cities, and durations, recorded not in a priest's hymn or a poet's riddle, but in what reads like an accountant's ledger. And the scribe who carved it did not blink. Today, we step into that enigma, not to worship it, not to blindly believe it, but to understand the weight of what it proposes. Because if the prism is even partly accurate, then our species is walking through history with amnesia. We are children looking backward through fog, trying to remember who built the first fire, who taught the first laws, who crowned the first kings, and why. But before we open this door, we need to understand the object that holds the key. Its modern name is the Weld-Blundell prism, though the men who found it could not have imagined how many theories, debates, and obsessions it would ignite. They discovered it in 1922, during an excavation in the parched soils of southern Iraq. Ancient Sumer, cradle of writing, mathematics, astronomy, city-states, kings, and the kind of stories that cling to the bones of our species. The prism is unassuming at first glance, about the size of a paperback. 4 narrow sides, each one packed from top to bottom with cuneiform inscriptions. Thousands of tiny, deliberate strokes arranged in orderly lines. When scholars first studied it, they expected more of what ancient tablets usually contain: inventories of grain, hymns, tax lists, legal records, or temple offerings. But this tablet did something different. It counted time. And it counted kings. And it counted them with a confidence that should not have survived 4,000 years. It begins with a statement so simple, so stripped of poetry, that it lands like a cold hand on the shoulder. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Just that. No parable, no mythic flourish. A procedural note. Kingship arrived, and it arrived at a place. And then the list begins, naming the first king, Alulim, and attributing to him a reign of 28,800 years. The second king, Alalgar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third, Enmenluana, 43,200 years. The scribe records 8 kings in total, ruling sequentially across a handful of ancient cities. And only then, after the last king steps off the stage, the tablet adds a single devastating line. Then the flood swept over. This is where scholars recoil. You cannot accept Gilgamesh in one part of the list, whose city walls have been dug from the earth, and then dismiss the earlier kings as fantasy. The text makes no distinction between myth and history, between divine and mortal, between the possible and the impossible. To the scribe, it is all one continuous story. So how do we read a document like this? And more importantly, why does it exist at all? To answer that, we have to return to its moment of rediscovery, 1922, and to the archaeologists who pried it from the drifting sands. Because although the prism was unearthed in Iraq, its meaning did not truly ignite until it reached the scholars of Oxford, who began the painstaking process of translation. At first, they believed it must contain exaggerations, metaphors, mythic cycles disguised as rains. But then, a strange detail emerged. The massive durations, 28,800, 36,000, 43,200, were not arbitrary. They were exact multiples of 3,600, a Sumerian unit of time known as a sar. This wasn't random inflation. It was mathematics. And mathematics, unlike myth, is not prone to poetic exaggeration. Mathematics means intention. The prism doesn't read like a legend. It reads like a record. A bizarre, impossible record, but a record nonetheless. Which leaves us with a dilemma. Either the ancient Sumerians were mythologizing their past with numbers far more structured than any myth requires, or they were documenting something they understood as real. Both options are unsettling, but only one forces us to confront an idea we are trained to reject. What if the oldest chapter of human history did not belong to humans alone? As we move through this investigation, our goal is not to blindly accept or lazily dismiss. It is to evaluate, to weigh, to compare what the prism claims against archaeology, geology, myth, mathematics, and logic. To examine the flood not as folklore, but as a timestamp. To examine ancient kings not as legends, but as entries in a cosmic ledger. But before we challenge the scholars or entertain the radicals, we must first understand the document itself, its structure, its tone, its intent. The Sumerian King List, in all its surviving versions, appears to have served one primary purpose: to legitimize kingship by offering a continuous chain of rulers stretching back into a pre-human age. This alone does not make it factual. Many ancient cultures wove divine ancestry into their royal lines. Egypt claimed its pharaohs descended from Horus. China claimed the mandate of heaven. Japan traced its emperors back to the sun goddess. But Sumer's claim is unique, not because it invokes divine kings, but because it quantifies them with engineer-like precision. It doesn't say, "a long time ago." It says, 28,800 years, exactly 8 sars, like a data point. This is the strangeness of the King List. The more rigid its numbers, the less metaphorical it seems. Modern historians prefer a different explanation, that these numbers are symbolic cycles, cosmological constructs, or dynastic aggregates. But the tablet never frames them as such. Instead, it arranges them like an unbroken chronology, a timeline that evolves naturally from divine kings to mortal rulers, as if describing the slowing heartbeat of civilization itself. And then, abruptly, there is the flood. A flood that appears not just in Sumerian tablets, but in Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, Norse, and even indigenous American traditions. A flood so universal that to call it myth is to assume every civilization coincidentally invented the same disaster. But for now, we restrain ourselves. That comes later. In this first chapter, our task is singular: to meet the prism on its own terms. This is not a tablet full of hymns or poetic hyperbole. It is not the ramblings of a prophet or the fantastical genealogies of a bard. It is a list composed by someone who believed, truly believed, that the origin of kingship was an event, a descent, an arrival, not from a distant land, not from a forgotten tribe, but from the heavens. And that raises a question so uncomfortable that even modern scholars prefer not to touch it. If the Sumerians invented kingship, why did they insist that kingship was not theirs? Why claim it descended? Why present authority as something external, delivered, bestowed? Who, or what, were they remembering? This is where skepticism is not just healthy, it is necessary. It is easy to fall in love with extraordinary claims. It is harder to trace them back through philology, archaeology, and parallel traditions without losing our grip on reality. But we will do both: investigate the possibility and the problems. Because whatever kingship descending from heaven meant, the prism treats it as historical fact. Not a divine visitation, not a symbolic blessing, an event, a start date. And that start date is followed by a list so extraordinary that it demands our attention, if only to understand why ancient scribes felt compelled to preserve it. Across this series, we will examine the prism not as believers, not as skeptics, but as investigators. We will test mainstream explanations. We will explore radical interpretations. We will consider Sitchin's theories of Nibiru and the Anunnaki, not to endorse them, but to understand why they resonate so powerfully with the prism's structure. We will examine global flood myths, genetic anomalies, archaeological discontinuities, and the strange explosion of knowledge that appears almost overnight in southern Mesopotamia. But those explorations come later. Right now, on this first step, we stand before the prism with one simple question. What is this object trying to tell us? Because at its core, the Weld-Blundell prism is not asking for belief. It is asking for attention. The prism is not flamboyant. It is not theatrical. It does not preach or threaten. It does not beg to be deciphered. It simply presents data, names, reigns, totals, and then moves on. Its tone is almost chilling in its neutrality, as though the scribe were not aware that he was recording something impossible, as though these numbers were as natural to him as the cycles of seasons or the patterns of stars. And perhaps, to him, they were. That's the unsettling part. Today, we live in a world where historical time is measured in centuries, where deep time is measured in millennia. But the Sumerian prism casually speaks in tens of millennia, as if describing the lifespan of a mountain or a god. The tablet seems to inhabit a scale of time that does not feel human at all. Which leads to a possibility, one that does not require aliens, but does require humility. What if the earliest human civilizations were remembering something older than themselves? Memory is not always accurate, but it is rarely invented without cause. So in this first part of our journey, as we confront the prism's strange chronology, we adopt a simple position. Suspend dismissal. Not disbelief, just dismissal. We allow the possibility that ancient people were not ignorant, not delusional, but transmitting something they believed was true. Something that mattered enough to carve into clay, permanent, durable, enduring. Knowledge they feared losing. knowledge they believed was slipping away. And so, as we move forward into this investigation, we begin with a single premise, a premise that will guide the chapters ahead. When ancient people speak, we listen. When they record, we read. And when they insist, we investigate. Because the prism is insistent. It insists that kingship began with an arrival. It insists that 8 rulers held dominion for 250,000 years. It insists that a flood erased a world before ours. And it insists that history is older, stranger, and more structured than the timelines we are taught. Now we begin the work of testing it. And so we close this first chapter with the same quiet challenge the ancient scribe left imprinted into clay. If this is not myth, if this is not metaphor, then what exactly are we looking at? That is the question we carry into the next part, where the numbers stop being strange coincidences and start behaving like a system. We ended the previous chapter with a question. If the prism is not myth and not propaganda, then what is it? To understand that, we need to step backward, beyond the kings, beyond the numbers, beyond the flood, into the moment this text was first uncovered and the world that preserved it. Because for a document as bizarre as the Sumerian King List, context is not optional. Context is the ground beneath its feet. Without it, the tablet is an artifact floating in a void. With it, the tablet becomes a voice speaking out of deep time. So we begin here, in the early 20th century, when archaeologists were fanning out across Mesopotamia, peeling back layers of earth and empire and myth. They were searching for temples, granaries, palaces, tombs, evidence of the world's first urban civilization. And instead, they found this: a prism, covered in careful, rhythmic script, a script that scholars understood but could not categorize. This was not a prayer, not a legal code, not a prophecy. It was a timeline. And that alone was startling. Most ancient cultures recorded stories. Few recorded numbers. Even fewer recorded numbers this systematically. Archaeology, by its nature, relies on layers. Each layer a timestamp, each object a fragment of a story. The deeper you go, the older the tale becomes. But the Sumerian King List does something archaeology itself rarely attempts. It compresses hundreds of millennia into a single text. It is as if someone took the entire prehistory of Mesopotamia and boiled it down to an outline, trimming away everything except names, places, and lengths of reign. To modern readers, this feels almost too organized, too curated, too intentional. And that is part of the mystery. Because during the initial decades of excavation across Iraq, at sites like Ur, Kish, Lagash, Eridu, and Nippur, scholars found dozens of tablets that covered everything from barley rations to lunar eclipses. But the King List stood apart. It didn't describe life, it described rule. It didn't track resources, it tracked authority. It didn't record myths, it recorded succession. Which raises an immediate question. Who would craft such a document? And who was it for? In the ancient world, scribes were not merely clerks. They were the memory keepers of their civilization. They were trained for years, often decades, to master cuneiform, the oldest writing system known. A Sumerian scribe was equal parts accountant, historian, linguist, and theologian. They wrote slowly, carefully, deliberately, because clay tablets offered no easy corrections. So when a scribe composed the King List, he was not idly copying stories. He was preserving something he believed mattered, something that defined kingship itself. something that legitimized power. Mainstream scholars suggest the king list was political, a tool used by later kings to unify various local histories into one grand narrative that placed themselves at the end of a continuous line stretching back to the dawn of time. This is the safe interpretation, the comfortable one, the explanation that doesn't require any leaps of imagination. But even within that interpretation, the text is odd. If the goal was legitimacy, why give the earliest kings lifespans so long that any sane reader, even in antiquity, would question them? Why risk absurdity in the opening act of your political statement? Why begin your propaganda with impossible math? That question lingers, unresolved. Because it is one thing to claim your ancestors were mighty. It is another to claim they ruled for 36,000 years. To accept the mainstream explanation, we must believe that ancient scribes were simultaneously brilliant enough to invent writing, mathematics, astronomy, and irrigation systems, and yet naive enough to think that anyone would accept reigns measured in tens of millennia. Unless, to the scribe, these numbers were not strange. Unless they were part of an older tradition. A tradition too deeply rooted to be altered. Let us consider this possibility. The scribe was not inventing the numbers. He was inheriting them. He was recording something passed down through centuries of oral memory, temple archives, or older tablets now lost. He did not understand the origin of the numbers any more than we do. He simply believed it was his duty to preserve them. This interpretation does not require aliens. It does not require lost civilizations. It requires only the humility to accept that ancient humans often preserved stories they did not fully understand. That said, the king list goes beyond storytelling. Its tone is not mythic. Its texture is not poetic. It is relentlessly factual. This is where archaeology collides with literature. The deeper excavators dug across Mesopotamia, the more they found that Sumerians were not prone to whimsy in their record-keeping. Tax receipts, harvest lists, temple inventories, these were written with the same neutral tone as the king list. And those records were accurate, often brutally so. If the same culture that gave us the first accountants also gave us a list of rulers spanning 241,200 years, we must ask, were they consistent in their seriousness? Or did they treat deep history differently from recent history? Most scholars argue that myth and memory merged in the king list's earliest sections. But that explanation becomes fragile when we realize that the list transitions from impossible reigns to historically verifiable ones without changing style, tone, or format. The switch is seamless. The scribe writes 43,200 years with the same tone he writes 43. To him, the difference was not significance, it was scale. This is where things get interesting, because in other fields, geology, paleoclimatology, and anthropology, we see similar patterns. Long stretches of prehistory recorded in broad strokes, followed by increasingly detailed layers as time approaches the present. A glacier may record thousands of years in a meter of ice. A human city may record a decade in a pile of tablets. So perhaps the king list is simply another layered record, condensing vast stretches of early memory into manageable units. But if that is true, the units themselves still demand explanation. Why SARS? Why multiples of 3600? Why this specific mathematical structure? We will explore that in a later part. For now, we return to the archaeologists of the 1920s, sifting through ruins older than empires, when they made a discovery that would complicate everything. They found not one king list, but many. Fragments from different cities, Kish, Nippur, Ur, Larsa, and others, all preserving variations of the same chronology. These were not regional myths. They formed a shared pan-Sumerian memory. That alone is extraordinary. Multiple cities, separated by rivalries, warfare, and cultural differences, all copied versions of the same list. That suggests the text had cultural authority. It was a reference document, a canonical source. In today's terms, it was a civilizational master file. If this were merely a myth, why preserve it so widely? Why standardize it? Why replicate it across generations of scribes? These questions make the king list far more than a curiosity. They make it a puzzle that refuses to be dismissed. But archaeology is not only about texts. It is also about strata, layers of soil that tell their own stories. So while scholars studied the prism's inscriptions, excavators surveyed the cities it named. And in those excavations, they found something startling. Cities like Eridu, Kish, and Shuruppak showed signs of abrupt cultural transitions, layered deposits of destruction, rebuilding, and sometimes flooding. Not a single global flood, but multiple regional ones, some catastrophic enough to be remembered for thousands of years. This convergence between text and strata does not prove the king list's claims, but it does show that its authors were not recounting pure fantasy. They were recalling real cities, real disruptions, real historical shifts. Which raises a deeper question. Were the enormous reigns of the early kings symbols of long eras rather than individuals? Possibly. But that explanation is still incomplete. Because even if the early kings represent epics, why are the lengths so precise? Why do they follow a mathematical pattern? Why use numbers at all? The simplest answer would be that Sumerians loved math. They did, but this was not ordinary math. This was cosmic math, astronomical math, patterned math. And this is where the prism begins to resemble not a royal boast, but a record system using a different calendar, one we no longer recognize. But before we go further down that path, we need to examine the list's structure itself, because the king list is not random. It follows a very specific narrative arc. Kingship arrives, kingship moves, kingship is interrupted, kingship resumes. This pattern is not natural. It is artificial. It is constructed. It is deliberate. Kingship is depicted not as a human invention, but as a transferable institution, something that can descend, relocate, vanish, and reappear. This is how the list treats political authority, as a physical object, a mandate, an inheritance from beyond the human realm. This idea appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian literature. Sumerians did not believe kingship originated from human ingenuity. They believed it was delivered, installed, assigned, which leads to a provocative interpretation, not necessarily extraterrestrial, but certainly hierarchical. Kingship was considered external, not emergent, not negotiated, bestowed. That worldview influenced everything: social structure, law, religion, and the very idea of what a king was. Kings were not rulers by might. They were rulers by mandate. This understanding becomes crucial when reading the king list, because the moment you accept that kingship was seen as descending from heaven, the entire list reads differently, not as myth, but as a form of cosmic genealogy. And that brings us to the purpose of this part of the series. Part 2 is about grounding ourselves before we dive into mathematical cycles, or radical interpretations, or flood geology. We must understand the King List as its authors understood it, as a structured, authoritative document rooted in a civilization that revered order, precision, and legitimacy. If we fail to see the list through Sumerian eyes, we will misread it through modern ones. So as we close this chapter, we return to the prism itself, to the scribe who carved it, to the tradition that preserved it, to the cities that copied it, to the layers of soil that echo it. And we end with a question that opens the door to part 3. If these numbers were meaningless, why were they so carefully preserved? If they were symbolic, why were they so mathematically perfect? If they were invented, why were they treated as facts? Because in the next part, we confront the one detail the prism cannot hide: the cycles encoded into its numbers. The scribe did not simply record reigns, he recorded patterns. And patterns always point to an underlying system. That is where we go next, into the arithmetic of antiquity, and the possibility that the earliest kings of Earth were measured not in human years, but in a calendar we have forgotten how to read. Before we move deeper into ancient cities or speculative histories, we need to examine the one element of the King List that refuses to be ignored. It's mathematics. Because the moment you strip away the names, the myths, the cities, and the theological framing, one thing remains shockingly intact: the numbers. They sit there, carved into clay with an accountant's precision, repeating in cycles so deliberate that calling them exaggeration feels inadequate, and calling them symbolic feels lazy. Something is encoded here, something intentional. And to understand the King List, we have to look at it the way a Sumerian would, not as a storyteller, not as a priest, but as a mathematician. Let's start with what we know. Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60. This is why we still divide circles into 360 degrees. Why hours have 60 minutes. Why minutes have 60 seconds. But the number that shaped their cosmology, their sense of cycles, order, and astronomical rhythm, was not 60. It was 3,600. The Sar. A Sar was not a mythic unit. It was a real measurement, the same way we use years or centuries. And this single unit is the key that unlocks the King List's structure. When you translate the early reigns into SARs, a pattern emerges so clean it almost feels like a code. Alulim, 28,800 years, 8 SARs. Al-Algar, 36,000 years, 10 SARs. Enmenluana, 43,200 years, 12 SARs. Enmengalana, 28,800 years, 8 SARs. Dumuzid, 36,000 years, 10 SARs. Ensipadzidana, 28,800 years, 8 SARs. The pattern is unmistakable: 8, 10, 12, 8, 10, 8. These are not random. Ancient myths are full of random. Ancient mathematics is not. And this is where the King List begins to shift from a strange historical document into something closer to an encoded sequence, an ancient algorithm expressed through kings and reigns. So the question is no longer, why do these kings have impossible lifespans? The question is, why are those lifespans arranged in cycles? To think like the ancient scribes, we must think cyclically. The heavens move in cycles. The moon moves in cycles. Floods, seasons, planting, harvesting, cycles. So what exactly is being cycled here? The simplest answer is eras, long phases of cosmic or political order. But simplicity is dangerous when dealing with ancient math, because the Sumerians didn't treat numbers as placeholders. They treated numbers as forces, as qualities of the universe. A number wasn't how much. A number was what kind. And the numbers 8, 10, and 12 weren't chosen randomly. They correspond to 8, balance and roots; 10, completion and authority; 12, cosmic order. These associations appear in temples, star charts, hymns, and even proportions in their art. So when the king list assigns reigns of 8, 10, or 12 SARs, it may not be describing human time at all. It may be describing phases of celestial order. But here is where the mystery deepens. If these numbers are symbolic, they are not fuzzy symbols. They are sharpened and precise, like mathematical statements. Why choose literal quantities for symbolic ideas? Unless the ideas themselves were measured. Unless these cycles were not metaphor, but observation. We can entertain that possibility cautiously, responsibly, without invoking extraterrestrial intervention. Civilizations have tracked large astronomical cycles before. The Maya tracked cycles spanning millions of years. The Egyptians tracked precession. The Indus Valley tracked lunar nodes. So here is a radical but terrestrial hypothesis. The king list records astronomical cycles translated into political language. If so, then the long-lived kings are not individuals. They are epochs tied to celestial rhythms. The descent of kingship could be an ancient way of describing the start of a cycle. Perhaps the alignment of stars, the shifting of seasons, or even longer cycles like precession. But that hypothesis has one major flaw. If these are astronomical periods, why do they reset after the flood? Why does the math collapse from clean cycles to irregular reigns? Something breaks the system. Something interrupts the numbers. Something resets the calendar. And that something is the flood. The king list treats the flood not only as a historical event, but as a mathematical boundary, a hard reset. Before it, time is measured in SARs. After it, time is measured in years. This is strange. Calendars don't break. Systems don't spontaneously change, unless the society that used the old system collapsed. Unless the knowledge tied to that system was lost, appropriated, or deliberately suppressed. Or, this is where the story stirs unease, unless the custodians of that system were gone. Not gods, not aliens, simply a priestly class, a group of scholars, astronomers, or ritual mathematicians wiped out by catastrophe. The flood would do that. This idea of a shattered intellectual lineage is supported by archaeology. In the layers corresponding to 2900 BCE in cities like Shuruppak and Kish, the physical record shows abrupt breaks, devastation followed by rebuilding, cultural loss, rapid changes in material production. A society resets. A knowledge system resets. A calendar resets. And the king list preserves the memory. But we must not ignore a different explanation, one that sits at the boundary of respectable scholarship and speculative history. The numbers resemble not merely cycles, but system logs. The king list, if interpreted literally as a record of administrators rather than rulers, begins to read like a maintenance schedule. 8 cycles, 10 cycles, 12 cycles, 8 cycles, 10 cycles, 8 cycles. Then a catastrophic failure. Then reboot. then new users. This is the interpretation associated with Zecharia Sitchin, but we do not need to accept extraterrestrial origins to understand the implication. Even on Earth, ancient civilizations used metaphorical kings to describe deities or cosmic forces governing eras. Egypt did it. India did it. Greece did it. It is entirely possible the Sumerians did too. But even within purely human frameworks, the math remains too exact to dismiss. It demands an explanation deeper than myth and more precise than symbol. So what are the possibilities? Let's examine them one by one. Possibility 1. Dynastic compression. Maybe the reigns represent whole dynasties, not individuals. 8 Sars could refer to an era in which a single clan held power. The problem? Dynasties are messy. They don't align into perfect multiples of 3600. They fracture, rebel, intermarry, collapse, revive, and split. Dynasties do not obey arithmetic. The King List does. Possibility 2. Seasonal years, not solar years. Some scholars have suggested that the King List may have used a year equal to a season or a lunar cycle. But this does not work. If the numbers are reduced by that factor, the post-flood kings become absurdly short-lived. And more importantly, it destroys the sexagesimal symmetry. The only way the sequences remain meaningful is if the reigns are measured in actual Sars. Possibility 3. Ritual reigns. Perhaps these long reigns reflect ritual roles, ceremonial offices tied to agricultural cycles, not biological lifespans. But again, ritual cycles are repetitive. The King List cycles are progressive. They escalate and decline. Possibility 4. Lost calendars. Perhaps the Sumerians used a now-forgotten astronomical cycle far longer than a year. The Sar could have been a cycle based on Venus, Jupiter, or lunar nodes. This theory has promise. The problem is historical collapse. There is no evidence that such a system survived into later periods. Which leaves the final possibility. Possibility 5. The numbers are literal, but not human. This is the interpretation people ridicule immediately, not because it lacks internal logic, but because it violates our modern assumptions about what the ancient world was. But whether one believes in extraterrestrial visitation or not, we cannot ignore the fact that the King List does not behave like a mythic document. It behaves like a log. And logs imply observers. Observers imply intention. Intention implies systems. So let us phrase the radical interpretation carefully, cautiously, without sensationalism. If a non-human group with longer lifespans governed early human communities, whether gods, spirits, mythologized ancestors, or something else, the King List could be recording their rule in their time units, not ours. This would explain why the early reigns use Sars, not years, why the numbers follow fixed patterns, why kingship descends rather than emerges, why the calendar resets after a catastrophe, why later kings suddenly have human lifespans, why the list merges mythic and historical figures seamlessly, why the scribe records everything in the same tone. This is not proof. It is simply a hypothesis that fits the data more cleanly than most academic explanations. But we do not have to leap to aliens. There is another explanation, equally unsettling and entirely human. A forgotten civilization. A human society older than Sumer, using a different calendar, wiped out by catastrophe, whose memory was later reduced to immortal kings. This theory, often overshadowed by more dramatic ones, is ironically the most plausible. We know human history reaches far deeper than we once believed. Göbekli Tepe is older than Sumer by 6,000 years. Jericho is older still. There are ruins underwater off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean, whose age does not fit the official timeline. The flood myths do not need aliens to make sense. They require only time, vast, deep time, and a society erased by rising waters. And the King List could be the last surviving artifact of that deeper memory, encoded into cycles the Sumerians preserved but no longer understood. But whether the numbers refer to alien calendars, pre-Sumerian dynasties, cosmic cycles, or lost knowledge, one fact remains. The King List is not random. Its math is deliberate. Its cycles are precise. Its structure is engineered. And when a text this old shows this much intention, the burden of proof shifts. We can no longer ask, why did they invent these numbers? We must ask, what were they trying to preserve? As we close Part 3, the pattern becomes clear. Before the flood, time is measured in cosmic units. After the flood, time collapses to human scale. Something broke. Something ended. Something began. So in Part 4, we explore the only logical next question. What kind of event can erase a calendar? What kind of catastrophe is powerful enough to destroy an entire mathematical worldview? What kind of flood leaves not just ruins, but amnesia? Because if the King List is a memory, then the flood is not just a story. It is the dividing line between two worlds, one ruled by cycles and one ruled by years. And to understand the mystery of the kings, we must first understand the day the cycles ended. If the King List encodes cycles, mathematical, cosmic, or administrative, then the flood is not merely a dramatic ending. It is a system failure, a reset. A rupture so deep that the calendar breaks, the numbers shatter, and history restarts from zero. The question is not whether such an event occurred. The question is what kind of catastrophe can erase not only cities, but memory. To answer that, we need to trace three layers of evidence: the myths, the archaeology, the geology. Each tells a different story. And yet, impossibly, all three converge. In the previous part, we saw how the rains before the flood are clean, cyclic, perfect, while the rains after the flood are jagged, irregular, undeniably human. This implies a dividing line so stark that no ordinary flood could explain it. Rivers flood, rivers rebuild, civilizations adapt. But the King List does not treat the flood as a river disaster. It treats it as the annihilation of a world. That claim is not hyperbole in Sumerian literature. Their myths describe the flood as a universal erasure, a violent end to an age when knowledge flowed from heaven to earth. And this would simply be ancient drama, if not for the fact that nearly every civilization echoes it. Take a moment to consider this. Cultures separated by oceans, by mountains, by millennia. Cultures with different gods, languages, calendars, and cosmologies. All tell the same story. There was a great flood, a global one, a world-ending one, and a handful survived.
Sumerians had Utnapishtim. Babylonians had Atrahasis.
Hebrews had Noah. Greeks had Deucalion. Hindus had Manu. The Maya had Coxcox. China had Yu the Great. The Maori had Ruatapu. The stories differ in detail, not in pattern. Is this coincidence? Mythic convergence? Or collective memory? Modern scholarship tends to treat these parallels as symbolic, archetypes of renewal, metaphors for seasonal floods, or narrative devices shaped by human psychology. And that could be true, but archaeology and geology complicate that theory. Because somewhere deep underground, in the strata of ancient cities and the sediment of ancient seas, the earth preserves a record more honest than myths or memory. And that record whispers something unsettling. Something enormous happened. Something fast. Something global. We begin with the land. In the ruins of Shuruppak, the final pre-flood capital of the King List, archaeologists uncovered a distinct, uniform layer of silt. Not a thin band, a thick wall of mud, nearly 10 feet deep in some areas, sealing off the older city from the newer one like a geological scar. Carbon dating placed this destructive event around 2900 BCE. Not mythic time, historical time. But this was not enough to claim a global flood. It was evidence of a catastrophic regional event, yes, but not the end of the world. So what about the rest of the Earth? This leads us beyond archaeology into the realm of paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates locked inside ice cores, sediments, and fossilized pollen. Here, the story expands in scale. Around 12,800 years ago, as the last ice age was ending, the Earth suddenly reversed course. Temperatures plummeted. Rain patterns shifted. Megafloods swept across continents. Scientists call this period the Younger Dryas. But one hypothesis, controversial, debated, fiercely defended by some and dismissed by others, proposes a trigger. A cometary impact on the North American ice sheet. Not a minor collision. A strike powerful enough to vaporize vast fields of ice and destabilize the entire glacial system. The aftermath? A megaflood, global sea level spikes, planetary shock waves. The geological signature is chilling. Charcoal bands from continent-wide fires. Microspherules melted by intense heat. Nanodiamonds formed under extreme pressure. Abrupt layers of flood-deposited sediment. A sudden, unmistakable die-off in megafauna. This is not fringe speculation. Multiple independent cores from Greenland, North America, and Europe show the same dramatic climate pivot. A world shifting in minutes, not centuries. If such an event occurred, and evidence continues to accumulate, it could explain more than mythology. It could explain why ancient civilizations cluster along coastlines, and why so many are now underwater. But here is where we must tread carefully. The geological Younger Dryas flood predates Sumer by thousands of years. The Sumerian flood is dated much later, around 2900 BCE. Two floods, two catastrophes, separated by time, merged in memory. A distant global trauma, a nearer regional one. Myth compresses time, memory merges events, histories become single stories. This merging is not unusual, it is human. But the King List adds something strange. It does not treat the flood simply as destruction. It treats it as a boundary line, a termination of an age measured in SARS. So the question becomes, what ended? A civilization? A lineage? A mathematical tradition? A knowledge system? Or something older? Before the flood, kingship descends from heaven. After the flood, kingship returns, but diminished. That phrasing is troubling. If kingship is not invented, but delivered, then the flood is not only a natural disaster, it is a rupture in transmission, a broken line, a severed connection. Some interpret this as metaphor for the loss of divine favor, others as evidence of political reorganization, and some, those willing to peer into the shadowy edges of alternative history, suggest it marks the departure of a ruling elite. Not gods in a supernatural sense, but gods in the Mesopotamian sense, powerful beings, not human, whose authority shaped an early world. Whether these figures were mythologized ancestors, members of a lost civilization, or something entirely alien, that is the debate. But one point is not debated. Every culture on Earth preserves a memory of a time before the flood when rulers were different, longer lived, wiser, closer to the divine. A golden age, followed by collapse, followed by a lesser age. This narrative appears in Egyptian dynastic lists, gods, demigods, spirits of the dead, then men. Hindu Yuga cycles, Greek ages of man, Sumerian antediluvian kings, biblical patriarchs. Different continents, different eras, same pattern. The question is why? Is it simply a shared psychological motif? A universal human longing for a lost paradise? Or is it cultural memory? Distorted, yes, but anchored in truth. If the latter, then the flood was not just physical. It was informational. A knowledge erasure event. The King List itself supports this interpretation. Before the flood, long reigns, perfect cycles, mathematical precision, divine origin. After the flood, short reigns, inconsistent numbers, human conflicts, political fragmentation. It reads like the difference between a system operated by its creators and a system operated by those left behind. This interpretation, carefully and cautiously considered, does not require extraterrestrials. A human civilization could collapse so entirely that its knowledge becomes myth. Imagine a society with a different calendar system, different lifespans, different astronomy, different mathematics. Imagine it being wiped out by rising seas. Imagine scattered survivors preserving fragments of its memory for thousands of years, retold orally, reinterpreted, ritualized. By the time Sumer emerges, the details are warped, but the structure remains. Kings were once gods. Their time was measured in cycles. The flood ended their age. We inherited what remained. And the prism preserves the outline. But there is a more unsettling possibility, one that sits at the boundary between science and speculation. What if both floods happened? And what if the Sumerian scribes inherited memories of both? A global flood in deep prehistory, a regional flood that ended their own civilization. Two catastrophes, one narrative. In human storytelling, distance collapses. Memory compresses. Trauma merges. A single unforgettable event emerges. The day the world drowned. And on that day, the SARS stopped. The cycles ended. The King List does not describe death. It describes interruption. Then the flood swept over. 4 words, 1 fracture. After nearly 250,000 years, the narrative halts. The tone shifts. The math collapses. The scribe begins again. After the flood had swept over and the kingship descended from heaven. Kingship returns, but it is not the same. The post-flood kings are not cosmic administrators. They are mortal rulers struggling through droughts, wars, and dynastic politics. Their reigns shorten decade by decade. By Gilgamesh's time, the divine blood, whether symbolic or genetic, is diluted. This decline mirrors the pattern in nearly every culture. Long-lived beings in the beginning, short-lived beings today. In myth, this is due to divine withdrawal. In biology, due to loss of knowledge or environmental change. In alternative theories, due to hybrid lineages fading. But regardless of interpretation, the pattern is universal. This brings us to a deeper question, one that Part 4 is meant to prepare us for. What was the world like before the flood? And what exactly was lost? Was it simply early agriculture and proto-urban culture, or was it something more structured? Something organized by a priestly elite with advanced astronomical knowledge? Did they track cycles we no longer understand? Did they encode their calendar into reigns because that was how their world was structured? The flood did not only destroy cities, it destroyed continuity. What came after was not the world's beginning. It was the world's recovery. We are accustomed to seeing humanity as the authors of civilization. The King List suggests we may be the inheritors of a ruined one. So as we close Part 4, one thing becomes clear. The flood is not simply a mythic deluge. It is a memory boundary, a civilizational firewall, a line drawn across time. Whatever came before it belonged to another world. Whatever came after it belongs to ours. In Part 5, we cross that boundary. We step into the antediluvian age itself. The forgotten world the King List claims lasted 241,200 years. The world before rivers changed course, before calendars broke, before memory dissolved into legend. The world that the flood erased, but did not entirely destroy. Because some traces survived, some stories endured, and some numbers, cut into clay, refused to disappear. If the flood marks a rupture, a boundary, a reset, then the world before it is not simply ancient history. It is another world entirely. A world governed not by dynasties, but by cycles. Not by human kings, but by something older. A world whose ruins do not survive, but whose architecture of memory remains buried in texts like the King List. To understand that world, we must follow the path laid out by the scribe. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. These are not random names. They are the sequence of cities to which kingship descended before the flood. To the Sumerians, this list was not geography. It was theology. It was cosmology. It was the story of how civilization itself moved, city by city, priesthood by priesthood, mandate by mandate. So what were these places? Why were they chosen? What did they share? And more importantly, what kind of world were they part of? Let's begin with the first city in the chain, Eridu, the first landing place. The King List starts simply. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Eridu is not mythic. It is real. Archaeologists have excavated its temples, its foundations, its layers of occupation. And what they found there is startling. Eridu begins fully formed. Other cities show evolution, gradual accumulation, experimentation, trial and error. Eridu does not. Its earliest temple appears suddenly, as if the blueprint came from somewhere else. This is the pattern. Eridu is the first complete city. Not the oldest settlement, there are older, but the oldest designed center of ritual, administration, and social structure. In other words, the first attempt at civilization. Which raises a question. How do you build civilization on the very first try? The Sumerians answered that plainly. You don't. Someone teaches you. That someone in their mythology was Enki, god of wisdom, water, creation, and knowledge. But whether Enki was a deity, a mythologized ancestor, or a symbolic figure representing a priesthood, the message is the same. Civilization was not invented. It was implemented. This is why the King List presents kingship as descending, not emerging. It mirrors the belief that knowledge itself arrived from a higher place. Higher not necessarily in the metaphysical sense, but in the civilizational one. Eridu is the place where that memory crystallized. But Eridu was not merely a religious center. It was a repository of something more peculiar, something Sumerians called the Me, sometimes written as Me. The Me, the divine blueprints. The Me are one of the least understood concepts in the ancient Near East. They are described in texts as powers, decrees, laws, attributes, functions, or essences, but these words are insufficient. The Me are modules, encoded principles, blueprints for how the world should operate. Sumerian texts list them: kingship, priesthood, music, truth, heroism, art, craftsmanship, judgment, the scribal arts, the foundations of cities. Dozens of them, each described as something bestowed, not invented. Some scholars interpret the Me symbolically. Others see them as metaphors. But to the Sumerians, they were literal. A king's power came from possessing specific Me, just as a computer's function comes from software. This is not poetic language. It is technical language, far more technical than we expect from the ancient world. The Me describes civilization like a system, with modules, functions, capabilities. This worldview pervades Sumerian literature. Civilization is not a human achievement, but an installed framework. Which leads us to the next city, the city of metal. Bad Tibira, the forge of gods and men. Bad Tibira means wall of the metalworkers. It was the second city of kingship. According to the King List, the rulers of Bad Tibira did not simply govern, they produced, forged, refined. In mythic language, they shaped humanity itself. This sounds fantastical, until we recall that metallurgy is one of the earliest and most transformative technologies in human history. Sumerians place its origin not in a workshop, but in a sacred center. Not as a discovery, but as a gift. Not as an accident, but as a deliberate act. From a modern perspective, this sounds mythic. But myth often encodes technological memory. And here is the strange part. Archaeologists have found no gradual development of metallurgy in southern Mesopotamia. It appears suddenly, advanced, organized, ritualized, just like Eridu's temple. Both Eridu and Bad Tibira represent firsts that do not evolve slowly. They emerge all at once, as if following pre-existing designs. This raises a controversial but necessary question. Were the Sumerians remembering a much older, lost culture, one whose knowledge they inherited but did not originate? A culture erased in the flood. A culture whose blueprints survived as the Me. Yet the King List presents these cities not merely as cultural centers, but as seats of authority. places where a different kind of leadership existed. Leadership measured not in charisma, strength, or divine blood, but in mastery of the me. This interpretation fits both mainstream scholarship and speculative theories. It does not require gods or extraterrestrials. It requires only the existence of a knowledge-holding class, a priesthood or elite, who carried fragments of pre-flood knowledge into post-flood times. But the King List does not stop at metallurgy. It introduces a third city, one wrapped in mystery. Larak, the Lost City. Larak is the most enigmatic city in the pre-flood sequence. Its ruins have not been definitively located. Its history is sparse. Its mythology is fractured. And yet, the King List places it as the third center of kingship. Why? Some scholars argue that Larak's absence in the archaeological record implies it was exaggerated or mythologized. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Entire cities vanish due to erosion, shifting rivers, or settlement overlays. Others suggest Larak represents not a physical place, but a symbolic one, a conceptual center associated with guardianship, judgment, or divine authority. But a more intriguing interpretation emerges when we compare the sequence. Eridu, knowledge. Bad Tabira, metal. Larak. Quote, knowledge, industry, authority. Three pillars of civilization. If this is correct, Larak represents a governance system, an administrative tradition preserved from the antediluvian age. This would explain why the King List insists that kingship moves rather than evolves. It is transferred from center to center based on the function of the me. The kings of Larak ruled shorter periods, less structured than the earlier cycles. It suggests a subtle decline, as if the me themselves were beginning to fragment, which aligns perfectly with the flood narrative, a slow unraveling of order before total collapse. Then comes the fourth city, Sippar, the city of Enoch and Utopia. Sippar holds a strange position in ancient memory. Babylonian myth describes it as the city where Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, was instructed to preserve knowledge before the flood. Some versions even claim Sippar housed a library of pre-flood wisdom. Meanwhile, Jewish traditions echo this motif through the figure of Enoch, a patriarch said to have preserved heavenly knowledge before the deluge. These connections are not accidental. They reflect a shared archetype. Before destruction, someone is chosen to preserve the blueprint of civilization. Sippar, in this reading, becomes a vault, a memory chamber, a repository of the me. And this is where the King List becomes prophetic. Only one city remains before the flood, as if even the scribes sensed that the sequence was approaching its end. Shurupak, the final stage. Shurupak is not mythical. It is deeply real. Its destruction layer is one of the clearest geological signatures of the ancient Near East. This is where the flood touches history. Archaeologists found an abrupt band of pure river silt, sealing the older city beneath it, freezing its last normal day like a photograph. If the King List marks a civilizational sequence, Shurupak is the final stage, the moment when knowledge, cycles, and me are on the brink of being lost forever. Its last king, Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, survives in nearly every regional tradition as the man who endured the flood. Not an emperor, not a conqueror, a preserver. Someone entrusted not with ruling, but with remembering. This is the pivot point. The King List is not simply a chronology. It is a map of knowledge transfer. And before the flood, That knowledge is centralized. After the flood, it disperses, fragmented, scattered, diluted. Which raises a question that sets the stage for Part 6. What exactly was being preserved? What was the content of the me? What was the firmware of civilization? Some scholars say it was ritual knowledge. Others say technological skills. Still others say cosmological data, astronomy, mathematics, cycles. But there is a deeper possibility. The me may not represent knowledge at all. They may represent capabilities, codes that enable a society to function, like modules installed into a system. Kingship is a module. Priesthood is a module. Law is a module. Craft is a module. Writing is a module. Judgment is a module. When the me are scattered, society decentralizes. When the me are lost, society collapses. When the me are preserved, society restarts. This interpretation fits all evidence: the archaeological, the mythological, the textual, the numerical. It also fits the flood. When systems fail, you reboot. When knowledge dies, you rebuild. When civilization collapses, you restart with what remains. The antediluvian world, if we strip away the mythic veneer, looks less like a realm of gods and more like a civilization with advanced administrative structures, consistent knowledge transfer systems, technical skill in metallurgy and construction, codified social modules, astronomical calendars encoded into reigns, and a tightly controlled priestly elite. A civilization shattered by catastrophe, and partially resurrected through fragments like the King List. So as we close Part 5, the question is not whether the antediluvian world existed. The question is, what did it look like? Who ran it? And how much of it survived? Because the King List does not just remember names. It remembers functions. It remembers structures. It remembers a world that operated on logic we no longer understand. In Part 6, we examine the connective tissue, the me themselves, the firmware of humanity, the encoded instructions for civilization. We ask the hardest question of all: were the first cities built or restored? Up to this point, we followed the movement of kingship from city to city: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak, watching as the ancient world evolves, fragments, and collapses. But that journey raises a deeper question. Not who were the kings, not how long did they rule, but something far more fundamental. What were they actually ruling? What was the system they inherited? What exactly made a city civilized? To the Sumerians, the answer was astonishingly clear. Civilization wasn't invented. It wasn't discovered. It wasn't even learned. It was delivered. As a package. As a set. As a suite of powers called the me. Today, we struggle to categorize the me. We reach for metaphors because we don't have modern equivalents. But the Sumerians didn't struggle. To them, the me were the operating codes of the world. Before we go further, hear that again. The me were codes, not symbols, not myths. Codes, capabilities, modules, functions of a system. This idea is startling because it feels modern, too modern for a civilization 5,000 years old. But that's the mistake we keep making, assuming ancient people lacked conceptual sophistication. The Sumerians didn't lack sophistication. We lack the ability to imagine how they thought. So let's attempt for a moment to see the world through their eyes. The me are not objects, they are permissions. Sumerian texts describe the me in a way modern readers can easily misunderstand. They are often called gifts of the gods or decrees of the divine. But in their original context, the me were more like protocols, rule sets, institutional powers, societal functions, creative rights, authorized capabilities. Consider what the me include: kingship, priesthood, truth, victory, craftsmanship, music, justice, writing, architecture, heroism, the arts, the ordering of cities, the foundations of law, the rituals of temples, the design of plows, boats, cities, lyres. This is not a mythic catalog. It's a civilizational inventory. Every function, every right, every role a society needs to operate is encoded in this list. This is why the me matter. Because if we take them seriously, even metaphorically, they reveal something astonishing. Sumerians believed civilization is modular, activatable, transferable, installable. And this belief was not abstract. It shaped how they built cities, how they structured institutions, and how they understood kingship itself. Kingship doesn't arise from charisma or power. It arises from possessing certain me, certain permissions. This view is radically different from how we imagine early societies. We think in terms of invention. They thought in terms of transmission. We think civilizations evolve. They thought civilizations were activated. And the king list fits perfectly into this worldview. Because the movement of kingship from Eridu to Bad Tibira to Larak is not the movement of rulers. It is the movement of me. Each city holds different modules. Each priesthood controls a different set. When power shifts, the entire operating system shifts with it. Civilization is not a pyramid. It's a network. But there's a deeper layer beneath this. The me as preserved technology. Let's be clear. We are not speaking about machines. We are speaking about knowledge. Structured, formalized, intentionally preserved knowledge. The me look like the remnants of a pedagogical system, a blueprint archive, a curriculum, an administrative technology. In modern terms, they resemble something between a constitution, a knowledge database, a skill tree, a technical manual, a cultural code book, a social software package. This is why the Sumerians believed the me were so precious, because without them, society collapses. And that is exactly what the flood represents. The catastrophic loss of the me. Not the loss of kings, not the loss of buildings, the loss of the codes that made civilization possible. If the me were preserved only partially or imperfectly, then the post-flood world would be a degraded version of the pre-flood one. And that is exactly what the king list describes. Before the flood, perfect cycles, long ages, cosmic order, unified knowledge. After the flood, fractured politics, short reigns, human lifespans, decentralized knowledge, competing priesthoods, reinvented technologies. In other words, the me were not destroyed. They were fragmented. Some survived in Eridu, some in Uruk, some in Kish, some in Ur, some in Lagash, some in Nippur. Civilization had to be rebuilt from modules that no longer fit perfectly together. And now we reach the uncomfortable core of Part 6. The Me behave like the remnants of an older system. Not mystical, not supernatural, not necessarily extraterrestrial, but older, structured, deliberate, designed. A system whose original custodians were wiped out in the flood, which leads to a provocative but grounded hypothesis. The Me are the surviving fragments of a pre-Sumerian knowledge tradition. A tradition with codified roles, astronomical knowledge, metalworking expertise, agricultural models, city planning standards, ethical frameworks, ritual structures, legal prototypes, formal education systems. This is not impossible. In fact, archaeology increasingly suggests we are missing entire chapters of human history. Göbekli Tepe predates Sumer by 6,000 years. Its builders were not primitive hunter-gatherers. They were ritual architects. They possessed geometry, engineering, and astronomical skill. But they left no writing, no Me, no king list, only stones. What if the Me are the textual descendants of even older traditions, preserved not in temples on a hill, but in portable archives carried through disaster? We do not need aliens to make this claim. We need only accept that humans had organized knowledge long before we assumed. But the king list opens a stranger possibility, one we must at least entertain. Could the Me represent knowledge from outside the human line? This is where interpretations diverge. Mainstream scholars read "descended from heaven" as metaphor. But the Sumerians did not use metaphor casually. When they said something came from heaven, they meant from above, from beyond, from the realm of the Anunnaki, beings who interacted with humans but were categorically not human. So what are the Anunnaki? Not angels, not demons, not gods in the modern sense. In their earliest form, they are the administrators of cosmic order, the executives of the Me. The Me belong to them. Kingship is granted by them. Knowledge flows through them. Civilization is implemented under their supervision. Later cultures turned them into gods. Earlier texts present them as functionaries. This is the conceptual paradox. The Me are too technical to be mythic. The Anunnaki are too structured to be imaginary. The king list is too mathematical to be symbolic. If we strip away the religious veneers added later, we are left with a model that feels eerily modern. A hierarchy of administrators, a set of operating modules, a system of cycles, a civilization based on permissions, a flood that wipes out the controlling class, a reboot under human stewardship. This is not mythology. It is software architecture. Am I claiming ancient Mesopotamia was run by extraterrestrial engineers? No. I am saying the Sumerians believed they inherited a once coherent system, and the Me are its fragments. We do not know how old that system was. We do not know who created it. We do not know if it was human, superhuman, or simply more advanced than we assume. But the king list and the Me suggest a startling idea. The antediluvian world was not primitive. It was organized, structured, encoded. And its blueprint survived the flood only partially. This is why Sumer appears so suddenly, why writing appears fully developed, why agriculture appears complete, why city life appears engineered. Sumer is not the beginning. It is the recovery. A messy, imperfect, brilliant recovery. And the me are the evidence. The fragmentation of the me and the rise of competing cities. Once kingship descends after the flood, something changes. Civilization no longer moves in one line. It splinters. Uruk, Kish, Ur, Lagash, Nippur. Each city claims legitimacy, not through mere mastery, but through possession of distinct me. The post-flood kings are no longer the administrators of a unified system. They are the heirs of broken code, trying to rebuild. This explains so much of early Mesopotamian history: the constant warfare, the rapid technological experimentation, the competing priesthoods, the emergence of legal systems, the diversification of art and architecture, the conflicting mythologies. They were not inventing civilization. They were reorganizing what remained. This interpretation, ironically, aligns both with mainstream archaeology and with the more speculative edge of pseudo-history. It allows for a pre-existing system without requiring extraterrestrials. It allows for the me to be literal without requiring supernatural beings. It allows the king list to be meaningful without requiring immortals. It bridges myth and reality. But there is one more step. The me as the key to the Sitchin hypothesis. This series does not blindly adopt Sitchin's claims, but we cannot ignore how closely the me align with his core concepts. Sitchin argued that an advanced group arrived from elsewhere. They implemented civilization. They granted knowledge. They installed kingship. They departed. Humans inherited a broken world. If we take the supernatural elements away and view the Anunnaki not as aliens, but as an elite knowledge class, either human or post-human, the parallels become striking. The me behave like the artifacts of such a class. Not physical artifacts, cognitive ones. Knowledge, permissions, capabilities, systems. Whether the origin of the me was human or not, the effect is the same. Humanity received civilization not as a slow evolution, but as an inheritance. And the flood severed the line. So we close Part 6 with a simple, disquieting realization. Civilization may not be a human invention. It may be a memory. Fragmented, distorted, reassembled, but a memory nonetheless. In Part 7, we examine the figure who bridges both worlds, the mortal and the divine, the historical and the mythic, the king and the seeker. Gilgamesh. If the me are the codes, Gilgamesh is the debug log, the human who tried to recover what was lost, the only king who asked the forbidden question: what was the world before the flood really like? Before we go deeper, consider this unsettling thought. If the me are fragments of a broken operating system, then someone, at some point, must have tried to restore it. Someone must have looked at the post-flood world with its shorter lifespans, fractured cities, fading knowledge, and asked, what happened to us? What did we lose? Who were we before the reset? And in the history of ancient Mesopotamia, there is only one figure bold enough, desperate enough, and powerful enough to try. His name is carved into clay tablets. His story is the oldest epic ever written. His shadow falls across 4,000 years of myth, religion, and kingship. Gilgamesh. But the Gilgamesh you think you know, the hero, the tyrant, the demigod, the seeker, is just the surface. The deeper truth is this: Gilgamesh is the first post-flood king who realized something was missing, and he is the only one who attempted to recover it. The king who refused to accept the new rules. The Sumerian King List records his reign almost casually. The divine Gilgamesh, whose father was Alilu, ruled 126 years. That single line hides a universe. Why call him divine? Why specify his father's nature? Why highlight his not quite human lineage? Because to the scribes, Gilgamesh represented a transitional being. Not fully God, not fully human. A hybrid. A remnant of the antediluvian bloodlines. A living fragment of the pre-flood world. One of the last carriers of the old me. But he was trapped in the new reality. Shorter lifespans, limited power, broken knowledge, decaying memory. Imagine being born with a sense of inherited greatness, a legacy of ancient kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, only to discover that your era offers you a mere century. Imagine knowing you are built for immortality in a world where death is now mandatory. The epic begins with Gilgamesh ruling Uruk with an iron fist, not because he is cruel, but because he is panicked. He feels the limits closing in. He senses the narrowing of human potential. He knows something is wrong. The world is smaller. Life is shorter. The sky is silent. The me are incomplete. And Gilgamesh refuses to accept it. The creation of Enkidu. A reset within a reset. The gods respond not by punishing Gilgamesh, but by creating a counterforce. Enkidu. This is often interpreted as a moral lesson, a wild man sent to humble a tyrant. But look deeper. Enkidu is shaped, engineered, formed from clay and essence. He is not born, he is made. A prototype of pre-flood humanity? A reconstruction attempt? A template for the natural human, unplugged from cities, knowledge, and hierarchy? 1. Gilgamesh and Enkidu represent two halves of a split species. Gilgamesh, the hybrid remnant of the me. Enkidu, the human reset of the post-flood world. When they meet, the world briefly reconnects. The past touches the present. Two lines cross that were never meant to reunite. And from this collision, something extraordinary happens. Memory awakens. The past resurfaces. The quest begins. The quest for immortality is not about immortality. Most readers believe Gilgamesh seeks immortality because he fears death after Enkidu dies. But that is only the emotional surface. His true quest is something else. He seeks the pre-flood operating system. He seeks the me themselves. He seeks to restore what the flood destroyed. The epic spells this out, if you know where to look. He does not go to a temple. He does not go to a library. He does not go to a priest. He goes to the only living being who remembers the antediluvian world. Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, the man granted eternal life, the final witness of the old cycles, the last carrier of the full me. Gilgamesh is not looking for personal salvation. He is looking for the lost blueprint. His journey is a recovery operation, a data retrieval mission, a desperate attempt to reconnect with the pre-flood source code. And this is why the gods panic. Because someone is trying to restore a system they deliberately shut down. The meeting with Utnapishtim, the key that doesn't fit. When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, something extraordinary happens, something most readers miss. Utnapishtim does not greet him as a stranger. He greets him as someone expected. He knows Gilgamesh's lineage. He knows his struggle. He knows why he came. But he gives him an answer that feels strangely rehearsed. You cannot have what I have. The age of immortals is over. Is he telling the truth? Or is he following a directive? Because Utnapishtim does not explain why immortality must be denied. He simply asserts it, as if repeating a rule, a shutdown protocol, a firewall. Then he performs a test, the infamous trial of staying awake. This is not a test of endurance. It is a test of compatibility. Gilgamesh fails not because he is weak, but because he is mismatched with the old system. He cannot interface with the antediluvian me. He is too human, or not human enough. The code doesn't run. The plant of rejuvenation, a patch, not a solution. After the failure, Utnapishtim reveals a plant that restores youth. Again, scholars treat this as a mythic symbol, but its function is clear. It is not immortality. It is maintenance, a temporary patch, a workaround, a fragment of the old technology stripped of its full power. Gilgamesh retrieves it. He holds the last surviving piece of pre-flood longevity. For a moment, he has it. But the serpent steals it. Why a serpent? Because in Mesopotamian symbolism, serpents are guardians of thresholds. They represent cycles, regeneration, old knowledge. In other words, the plant returns to the system it came from. It is reclaimed by the closed pre-flood domain. Gilgamesh is locked out, permanently. He cannot bring the old cycle into the new age. He cannot restore the me. He cannot reverse the reset. He must build civilization with the fragmented pieces available to him. And something extraordinary happens. He does. What Gilgamesh actually discovers. At the end of the epic, Gilgamesh returns to Uruk. He stands before its great walls, which he built earlier, and he realizes something profound. The only immortality left is legacy. This line is widely interpreted as philosophy, but in the context of the King List, the me, and the fragmented post-flood world, it means something else entirely. Civilization must now be built from human hands. Not divine cycles, not cosmic decrees, not immutable ages. Gilgamesh is the first king to embrace this new reality. He shifts civilization from inherited to constructed, from descending from heaven to rising from earth. His reign marks the moment where the gravitational center of civilization moves from the divine to the human. The me will never be complete again, but fragments are enough to build cities, code laws, write stories, and shape cultures. Gilgamesh is not the last echo of the antediluvian world. He is the first architect of the new one. Gilgamesh as the bridge between two histories. This is why his story matters so much to the King List. He is the single figure who connects the pre-flood world, longevity, cosmic order, divine kingship, unified cycles. The post-flood world: mortality, political conflict, human innovation, fragmented knowledge. The king list begins with the gods. It ends with the kings of history. Gilgamesh is the hinge, the pivot point where myth bleeds into fact. Without Gilgamesh, the king list collapses into fantasy. With Gilgamesh, the king list becomes a timeline. He is the anchor that ties the impossible to the verifiable. The figure that forces us to ask, if this part is real, how much of the rest was real too? A final question. What did Gilgamesh see? We know Utnapishtim told him the story of the flood, but the tablets also hint at something else, something Gilgamesh never fully reveals. He learns not just what happened, but why. Something triggered the reset. Something severed the kingly line. Something destroyed the continuity of the me. Did Gilgamesh learn the true cause? Did he glimpse the nature of the gods who ruled before the flood? Did he understand why their world ended? The epic is silent, which itself is suspicious. Silence in ancient texts is rarely accidental. It often signals missing knowledge, knowledge removed, hidden, or deliberately suppressed. Perhaps the scribes chose to omit it. Perhaps the priesthood considered it dangerous. Or perhaps Gilgamesh understood a truth that could not survive the new world. A truth we will explore in the next part. If the pre-flood world was real, what happened to it? Why did it collapse? And who, or what, caused the reset? The answer may lie not in myth, but in geology, climate science, orbital mechanics, and the long memory of the Earth itself. Before we continue, pause and consider the most unsettling thread that has run silently through this entire story. The antediluvian world didn't simply vanish, it was deleted, wiped, reset, erased so thoroughly that only fragments, myths, such names, survived. A world that lasts 241,200 years does not simply fade away like a forgotten empire. It ends because something ends it. And the king list presents that ending in a single, cold sentence. Then the flood swept over. But why? A flood can destroy cities. A flood can drown people. A flood can erase monuments. A flood cannot erase knowledge. A flood cannot erase systems. A flood cannot erase operational codes passed down for hundreds of millennia. Something else happened. Something more deliberate. Something more final. This is the heart of Part 8, understanding why the first world fell and what force, natural or intentional, erased it. The flood as a cover story. In Mesopotamian texts, the flood is presented as judgment. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it is divine wrath. In Genesis, it is moral cleansing. In Greek myth, it is Zeus's reset. In Hindu tradition, it is a cosmic correction. Different cultures, different gods, same event. This alone is extraordinary. But something more curious emerges when you line these stories together. All of them avoid explaining the real mechanism. All of them mask the cause behind divine will. All of them obscure a physical process with theological language. This is a pattern, not a coincidence. When different civilizations tell the same story but refuse to name the cause, it usually means one thing. The cause was traumatic, incomprehensible, or dangerous to remember. So let's remove the divine language and ask the forbidden question. What actually happened? The geological trail of a lost world. Geology is stubborn. It does not care about myths. It does not care about kings. It does not care about rewriting history. But it leaves scars, the kind that cannot lie. And around 12,800 years ago, Earth bears a scar unlike any other. A sudden dip in temperature, a global climate crash, a megafaunal extinction, wildfires stretching across continents, shock quartz, microspherules, high platinum concentrations, glass melt layers. The signature is unmistakable. An impact event. But not a single asteroid strike. The evidence suggests multiple fragments, most likely from a disintegrating comet, slamming into the North American ice sheet. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Mainstream scientists still debate it, but the physical indicators are there. Nanodiamonds, melt glass, soot layers, elevated platinum, massive shifts in ocean circulation, abrupt climate reversal. If this impact destabilized the ice sheet, it would trigger global flooding, sea level spikes, mega tsunamis, atmospheric shock waves, ash cloud cooling, agricultural die-off, societal collapse. In other words, a real-world global reset, the closest geological match to the flood myth. And it aligns with the approximate time frame of the end of the Golden Ages described in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Indian, Greek, and Native American traditions. So is that the answer? A comet? A cosmic accident? A natural catastrophe? Not entirely, because there's a problem, a glaring one. The timeline doesn't match the King List. The Younger Dryas event happened around 12,800 years ago, but the King List places the flood, symbolic or literal, far later, closer to 2900 BCE in some strata. So what's going on? Either the Sumerians conflated multiple disasters into one mythic event. Our chronology of early civilizations is off by millennia. The flood is describing something more complex than a singular moment. The King List preserves memory from a world far older than archaeology currently recognizes. Option 1 is convenient. Option 2 is controversial. Option 3 is likely. Option 4 is explosive. Because if the King List preserves memory that predates known civilization by tens of thousands of years, then we must ask, what kind of society preserves records across geological catastrophes? And why did that society end? This leads us to the next layer. The system that collapsed. The King List describes the antediluvian world as centralized, stable, mathematically ordered, governed by long-lived rulers, organized across multiple cities, united in kingship, aligned with cosmic cycles. This is not a primitive culture. This is not a handful of villages. This is not hunter-gatherers scratching symbols on stones. This is a complex, systematized civilization. One question: was it human? If humans built it, they must have possessed knowledge that archaeology has not yet found. Advanced astronomy, centralized governance, agricultural engineering, formalized mythic cycles, shared cultural lexicons, unified administrative models. If humans did not build it, or did not build it alone, then we must reconsider the origins of the me. Either way, The antediluvian system was not a loose federation of tribes. It was a coherent global order. And coherent systems collapse in two ways: internal breakdown, external shock. Which one destroyed the first world? Let's examine each. The internal breakdown theory. This theory argues the antediluvian world collapsed because of resource exhaustion, ecological mismanagement, overpopulation, social revolt, elite fragmentation, technological overreach, genetic or biological decline, breakdown of centralized control. This model parallels real collapses: the Late Bronze Age, the fall of Akkad, the decline of the Maya, the disintegration of Rome. In this interpretation, the flood myth symbolized social collapse, not literal water. The gods withdrawing meant institutions dissolving. The long ages shrinking meant knowledge lost. This is plausible, but it doesn't explain the global reach of the flood myth, or the precision of the king list numbers, or the suddenness of the collapse, or the uniformity of the timeline across cultures. So we turn to the second theory, the external shock theory. This theory argues the antediluvian world ended because of comet impact, solar outburst, rapid pole shift, abrupt sea level rise, mega tsunamis, volcanic winter, cosmic radiation event. The evidence for global catastrophe near the Younger Dryas boundary is overwhelming. But here's the issue. If the comet destroyed the world, why do so many myths portray the flood as intentional? Why do the gods decide? Why is humanity judged? Why does one man get warned? Why is kingship described as restarting? Unless the external catastrophe wasn't the cause. It was the instrument, the tool, the method. Which leads us to the third theory, the one the ancient texts quietly imply but never state: the controlled reset theory. This is the most controversial interpretation, and yet it is the one whispers behind every myth. That the flood was not a natural disaster. It was a reset, a pruning, a deliberate erasure of a system that had run its course. Evidence for this appears in Sumerian texts, Hebrew texts, Babylonian myths, Greek traditions, Vedic cycles, Hopi stories, Mayan cosmologies, Egyptian priestly lore. In each, a superior order judges humanity. A decision is made. Destruction is executed. A remnant survives. Civilization restarts. This is not the language of meteorology. This is the language of governance, the language of systems, of management. A cosmic, hard reset. The king list becomes clearer through this lens. The antediluvian kings weren't local rulers. They were administrators of a world cycle. Their reigns measured not in human years, but in cosmic periods. Their fall represents the termination of that cycle. So what went wrong? Why reset the system? The answer appears indirectly in Mesopotamian myth. Humanity becomes too noisy, too numerous, too ambitious, too independent, too aware. The gods, whether divine, symbolic, or metaphorical, fear loss of control. This resonates with Sitchin's hypothesis, but does not require extraterrestrials. It requires only this: a class of beings, or humans, who once held centralized control, lost it. So they wiped the slate. But something unexpected happened, something the controllers did not anticipate. Humanity survived with more memory than intended. They carried fragments of the me. They rebuilt cities. They reassembled cycles. They rediscovered writing. They reconstituted kingship. They retraced the forbidden knowledge. Gilgamesh's entire story is evidence of this unintended survival. And that brings us to the final question of this part. If the first world was destroyed, who destroyed it? There are 4 possibilities. 1. The Earth itself. A comet, a pole shift, a cascading climate collapse. 2. A human elite. A priestly or scientific class who lost control and initiated a reset. 3. A non-human intelligence. Not necessarily extraterrestrial, possibly post-human, interdimensional, or symbolic of a vanished species. 4. A hybrid of nature and intention. A natural disaster exploited or triggered by a ruling class to wipe clean a system they could no longer manage. The King List gives no answer, but it does give a clue. The reset was not a failure. It was a transition. Because the moment the flood ends, the same sentence appears. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven. Not returned, not reawakened. Descended. As if the next cycle began on schedule. Part 9 explores that mystery. If the pre-flood world was deliberately erased, why was kingship reinstalled afterward? And what, or who, chose the next rulers? The reset may not have ended the system. It may have rebooted it. And the question for us is simple. Are we still living inside that system today? What if the strangest thing about the Sumerian King List isn't the impossible rains, the vanished cities, or the echoes across global mythologies, but the fact that we've spent a century looking at it exactly backward? What if the King List isn't exaggerating the past, but simplifying it? Reducing something vast, chaotic, and cosmically scaled into a linear story humans could actually hold in their hands. Because after tracing the artifact's numbers, its patterns, its mathematical precision, its parallels in Egypt, India, China, and the Bible, one unsettling possibility begins to form. A possibility so simple, it feels like the one explanation we've been trained not to consider. What if the Sumerian scribes weren't telling a metaphor? What if they were telling the truth? Filtered, compressed, incomplete, but still truth. This is the threshold the King List brings us to. A place where history becomes unstable, where memory might stretch beyond the human, and where myth refuses to stay in its lane. And standing there, with the prism's cuneiform wedges staring back at us, one question begins to loom like a shadow behind everything we think we know. But before we get to that question, let's strip the problem to its bones. The simplest explanation, the one mainstream historians prefer, is that ancient kings claimed divine ancestry not because it was true, but because it worked. A myth of gods walking beside humans made power easy to justify. The flood acted as a clean dividing line between the time before and the time after. And the long rains? Well, those were cosmic numbers, symbolic cycles, poetic exaggerations. In other words, the King List is brilliant propaganda pretending to be history. And maybe that's all it is. But when you look closely, truly closely, that explanation begins to fracture. Because propaganda doesn't normally follow a mathematically perfect pattern of 8 SAR, 10 SAR, 12 SAR. Propaganda doesn't align with the lifespans in Genesis, the divine dynasties in Egypt, or the Yuga cycles of India. Propaganda doesn't match geological evidence of sudden climate collapse. And propaganda absolutely doesn't treat mythic figures like Dumazid and historical kings like Gilgamesh with the exact same dry, bureaucratic tone. It's almost as if the scribe didn't know he was supposed to draw a line between myth and history. As if, to him, there was no line. That's where the second explanation emerges, the misread history interpretation. The idea that each name actually represents a dynasty, or that the numbers count lunar cycles or seasons, or that translators misunderstood an ancient system of time. And yet, every one of those fixes creates more problems than it solves. You lose the SAR pattern. You break the cosmic symmetry. You end up with reigns too short to matter. And none of it accounts for why so many unrelated cultures remember the same arc. Long lives, divine rulers, a catastrophic flood, and a new, diminished humanity. Which brings us to the third explanation, the radioactive one. The one scholars won't touch because it contaminates everything. It's the possibility Zecharia Sitchin championed, that the King List is literal, not metaphorical, not political, not poetic. Literal. That the pre-flood kings really were beings with lifespans measured in millennia. That kingship descended from heaven because the first kings truly weren't from earth. That humanity's sudden leap into civilization was the result of an external acceleration, not a slow internal evolution. That the flood was a reset, whether natural or engineered, after which the long-lived rulers withdrew, leaving hybrid successors and a fractured, confused population to rebuild. This interpretation is intoxicating because it makes every anomaly snap into place. It makes the King List feel less like mythology and more like a redacted mission log. And yet, it demands an enormous leap. A leap past what is confirmed. A leap past what is comfortable. But here's the part we can't ignore. No matter which explanation you choose, none of them actually close the case. The propaganda theory can't explain the global parallels. The misread history theory can't explain the mathematical precision. The literal theory can't prove its astronomical claims. Every path leaves something unsolved, something hanging in the air like dust that refuses to settle. Which forces us to confront the possibility that the King List isn't meant to be understood as a single document, but as a surviving piece of a much larger system of knowledge. A system scattered across continents, recoded into myths, fractured by floods and migrations, and eventually compressed into symbols because the full truth was too large for early civilizations to retain. Maybe the 8 antediluvian kings weren't rulers, but eras. Maybe they weren't eras, but lineages. Maybe they weren't lineages, but a species. Or maybe, and this is the most unsettling possibility, they were all three. Because when you strip the King List down to its structural essence, the document is telling us one unshakable thing. There were ages before our age. Entire cycles of history that ended before ours even began. And the flood wasn't just a disaster, it was a border. On one side, beings with impossible lifespans. On the other, us. Civilization didn't start after the flood. It restarted. The King List's purpose may not be to explain what happened, but to make sure we never forget that something happened. Which brings us to a final, unavoidable reality. The prism asks a question far larger than archaeology. It forces us to look at our species not as a clean, self-contained timeline, but as something interrupted, something edited, something inherited. And that's where the last line of the list, the last breath of its ancient scribe, becomes less a statement and more a dare. Then the flood swept over. No explanation, no commentary, just a boundary. A boundary the scribe expects us to cross. So here we stand, at the edge of a story too big for history and too precise for myth. We stand with a document that is either the most extraordinary artifact ever discovered or the most elaborate riddle ever written. And that leads to the final hook. The question the King List has been whispering for 4,000 years. If the first kings weren't human, then who, or what, was humanity meant to become? Are we the end of the story, or the beginning of its next chapter? Because the King List doesn't close a mystery, it opens one. And the real secret buried in that baked clay is not the names of 8 ancient kings, but the possibility that we are still living in the shadow of their world.